And it's a lesson that is chock full of practical stuff that we can do, because it turns out there is plenty that we can do to bridge gaps in our divided families and jobs and neighborhoods, in our friendships. But the problem is we can't get to the practical stuff until we deal with our own internal instincts. Because if our instincts keep betraying us, as I said last week, if they keep telling us to zig when in fact we need to zag, we're not going to be able to sustain any of the practical things that we can talk about in this lesson. So we're starting our lesson, Oneness People in a Two-ness World, with a preliminary lesson on sin. Sin is not that big a deal. Now, we saw last week the Western Church's sin story has metastasized. It has spread. We don't use the word sin anymore, but the basic shape of that story, it's everywhere. There are good people, and there are bad people. And you, dear nighttime cable viewer, you are good and true. And you, dear social media follower, you are right-headed and virtuous. Those other yahoos, they are bad people doing bad things. So it got really loud down here. Is that permanent? So if you grew up in church, I bet you heard an egregious misinterpretation. Underscore that. An egregious misinterpretation of a Jesus parable. It goes like this. There are two lines going into the afterlife. One line is for sheep. That's us, the good people, the going to heaven people. There's another line, it's for goats. That's them, bad people, going to hell people. Now, I did say misinterpretation. That's not at all what Jesus' story was about, but given how Rome perverted our sin story, it is how most of us absorb that story, and it is what has gotten into the deepest parts of our instinct. Two lines that will divide us for all eternity. And with the threat of eternal existence in the balance, well, those two lines are dividing us right now as well, because we can't be around those people. They're bad people. They do bad things, and their badness might rub off on us, and we might get sucked into that other line. So we have to work hard to be a separate people. You might have heard that term in church, a holy and set apart people. You might have heard those terms, because we're working hard on this. We've prayed the right prayer. They have not. They are sinners. They sin. Now again, fewer and fewer people believe in that religion. Fewer and fewer people believe in that version of the afterlife. But the point isn't whether we believe that story or not. The point is that that story has metastasized. It has spread well beyond religion. Even as we are increasingly giving up on Western religion, the story is in there, and it's driving the breaking of our society. Because that story preys upon, as we saw last week, our brain's natural instinct to categorize. Familiar, not familiar, known, not known, safe, not safe. So, when the networks and the trolls want to build a following by giving people what they want, our religion provided a convenient script for what people want. I want you to confirm my brain bias. I want you to entrench my categories, and I want you to do that by telling me that our tribe is good and safe and in the right place, and theirs is wrong, unsafe, in the wrong place. It's a mess, and we Christians have no small part in the mess. So we have to start at the starting place, which is our own instincts and our own history. Now, it is always helpful when deconstructing a deeply held narrative to explore where the narrative came from. So today, a little bit of history. Now, in our own community, Common Thread, we did not start deconstructing our sin story with today's title, Damn Roman Empire Just Won't Quit. We didn't start there, but we got there. Where we started was, sin is not that big a deal. Sure, it'll ruin your life. Hate will do that. So will greed and pride and lust. They'll ruin your life. They will hurt you. But ours is not a story about sin. Ours is a story about grace. So let's put our focus where the focus belongs. There's a mountain of grace. There's a boulder of sin. Let's not focus on the boulder. Let's focus on the mountain. That's where we started. But even as that story began to settle in, it didn't really unseat our good people, bad people instincts. It didn't unseat our jump on even a whiff of sin instincts. That stuff, it just kept cropping up. I've got stories, I'll tell you. They sucked up all of our energy, those instincts, those narratives, those reactions, those responses, so we had to start digging a little bit deeper. And when we started digging deeper, we ran into Augustine, and we ran into original sin. Here's what Augustine said. He said, "We are all born irredeemable sinners. Every human being is born bad. Every one of us, and there's not a thing we can do about it, born bad." Now, Augustine would have fiercely objected to how we begin and end each service. Carriers of the inner light, every one of us, carriers of divine spirit. No, he would have said. Carriers of ugly sinfulness, every one of us. That's the story. You are born bad people doing bad things. And unless you have asked forgiveness since your most recent sin, when you show up for church, you are a carrier of ugly, ugly sinfulness. Now again, it's a religious story, but that's not the point. The point is that it's become a Western civilization story. You are bad unless. You're bad until you've done whatever the thing. Now, after Augustine, 1,000 years later, the church, Western religion, was still peddling that story. The Heidelberg Confession in 1563, that's how we teach our kids about religion. We get them to memorize a confession. Humans are totally unable to do good, it says. Humans are totally inclined to evil. And then Machiavelli, he came along and he took that theme outside of religion, began to introduce it into governance, and he said everyone would be a tyrant if they could. So did the American founding fathers. John Adams wrote, "We are descended from endless generations of murderers." It is our Western truth. Now later in the lesson, some data. Get that Humankind book. It'll be really helpful. It's a Western truth, but it's not a truth that is true enough. You might have read Lord of the Flies. You had to read it in school. Schoolboys, innocent looking enough, but shipwreck them on an island, let their true natures come out. Whoa, bad people doing bad things, because that, the premise is human nature. Well, Augustine got his story somewhere, but after he got it, he amped it up, and he amplified it so that now it is everywhere in Western society, mucking up everything. But here's the thing. Western Christians and Western society believed Augustine. But Eastern Christians, not for a minute. Nor did the Quakers, nor the mystics, nor the contemplatives, nor the Celtic Christians, nor did Jesus in the book of John, nor did the early writers in the Christian faith. Nope. This is pretty much just in the West, and pretty much because of damn Roman Empire. Jesus' story was a Jewish story. And in the Jewish story, the earth and everything in it, which includes you and me, and also includes them, carries divine breath, because we are made out of divine breath. That's our origin story. What makes human beings according to our cosmological myth, our very first chapter in the book, we are, every one of us, carriers of divine breath. We are, every one of us, carriers of inner light. So how did that story become born bad? Again, the Roman Empire. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, we Christians were a small movement. Now, let me pause for a moment and say, when I say we Christians, I am really saying me, because I do identify as Christian, but I am fully aware how difficult that is for a lot of folks. And you may not identify as Christian, and that is okay, but I do so because I have a historical perspective. Like a lot of people, I cannot identify with a lot of things that purport to be Christian, but history, but bigger picture, some bigger picture that I'm going to give you in the course of this lesson. So I identify, so I say we began, me. We began as a small offshoot of Judaism on the backside of nowhere. And for the first 2 centuries, we were just trying to figure out who we were. We were Jewish. Yeah, but then we were not really Jewish. All those straight Roman roads gathered together a whole bunch of disparate people, and that forced us to rethink our version of God. God stopped being God for just our little sect and became a God for a bigger world than we even knew existed. So by the 3rd century, we had become a thing. We had become a thing with our own ideas, a thing with our own sacred texts. Now, there were lots of different ideas, and there were lots of different sacred texts. We were not a monolithic group, not at all, but collectively, we were getting big enough that Rome began to feel threatened, started to protect itself from our corrosive ideas undercutting their social fabric. So then that became a century of persecution for us, feeding the lions kind of persecution. But try as it might, the Roman Empire couldn't stamp out an idea, couldn't stamp out the experience of a growing number of people that were rooted in that idea. And the idea is the divine is in me, and in you too. So drawing from that experience, the divine is in me, the divine is also in you, we begin to love one another. People said back then, those Christians, they are defined by their love one for another. Well, that's what happens when you have a story that says the divine's in me, but the divine is also in you. But we didn't stop there. We began to love those around us, especially those who were in need. We became people who served people, who cared for people, especially the disenfranchised. And in the Roman Empire, there were a lot of people who were disenfranchised. If you were not a citizen and not a male, you were disenfranchised. And the care for those people was not part of the Roman social fabric. And so we stepped into that and began to care for the people who were hurting and who were being crushed under this way of governance. We had a story that said Jesus showed us what it looks like when a human being gets in touch with the divine center. And then Jesus prayed for us that we would experience that same connection to the divine. And sure enough, when we began to look for that center within us, we found it. We found the same spirit in us that was in Christ Jesus. That's how Paul wrote it a few years later. It's in us. It's in all of us. And that was an idea that evoked an experience that Rome could not stamp out. And so, under the heading of, if you can't beat them, join them, Christianity became the official religion of the empire. That was Constantine. That was the 4th century. Now, I learned something that I didn't know this week. Constantine didn't technically convert to Christianity. His mother did. But what he did was become a patron of one Christian splinter group. And he chose that splinter group because that group kept the Hebrew scriptures sacred. Not all of the Christian splinter groups had done that. They didn't all keep the Hebrew scriptures, what is often called the Old Testament. Constantine liked that group because those texts held the story of David. And David was an imperial king, just like Constantine. And God demanded loyalty to the imperial king, which of course worked for Constantine. Religion and imperial power, God and emperor, I think I'll sponsor that group. So that splinter group became the recognized form of Christianity, here at this part, in the West. In the West. That group gave Constantine a story and evoked a form of cohesion about God and about governance that story was powerful enough to consolidate his power, helped him conquer the West, and helped him conquer even the Greek East. And the relationship didn't hurt the church either, not a bit, because they began to enjoy their newfound power. They began to enjoy federal funding. They began to enjoy enforced obedience to their decrees. This symbiotic relationship seemed to be good for everybody, except for what happened to religion in the West. When we got in bed with power, things took a bad turn. But power is intoxicating, and so we stayed in bed with power and have from then until now. After Rome fell, we got into bed with the Spanish Empire, then the French, and the English, and the German, and the American. Western Christianity actually became a religion of empire. It became imperial Christianity. And that has been an unqualified negative for our spirituality. Ugly stuff started to happen, and then ugly stuff kept on happening. We became intolerant of anyone who thought differently. Think inquisitions, think stretching on the rack, think burning at the stake. That's what empire does. We started organizing ourselves around power and money, popes and bishops, magisterium, priests, and we disempowered ordinary people. Ordinary people, we even came up with a new name for them. We called them the laity, thereby alienating them from an ownership stake in their own religion. That's what empire does. We unified around whatever story the bishops wanted us to tell, around whatever behavior the bishops wanted us to do. And the power lines became permanent and fixed and unambiguous. Church leaders were at the top, and everybody knew church leaders were at the top. That's what empire does. And we started paying tribute. That's also what happens in empire. Church developed a very unhealthy relationship with money, and basilicas, and cathedrals, and great big payrolls. Again, what empire does. But all that power, as I said, it is intoxicating. And all we had to do to get it was make the emperor, the official or unofficial, head of the church. Do that, and we got an inside track. We got recognition, we got protection, we even got tax benefits, which was all very cozy and all going along swimmingly without anyone noticing that to get that power, we had to change our story. I was reading a history professor's blog this week. There's a mosaic in Ravenna in northern Italy. This is what he said. He said, I show my classes this mosaic. It's a handsome, beardless man in a Roman uniform, and he's stepping on the head of a lion, and he's holding a standard, and on that standard it says, I am the way and the truth and the life. So there he is, decked out in Roman regalia, and I ask my students, who is that? And they always guess, because they can't read the Latin, and they say, well, that's the Roman Empire, the Roman emperor. And he says, no, it's not. That's Jesus. So yeah, we kind of changed our story. We became imperial Christianity. And we especially changed our sin story. We especially changed our human nature story. And when we did, that changed everything. Here's the thing. Empire is empire because of conquest. Somebody goes somewhere to conquer somebody else. Then that somebody else gets absorbed into empire, thus making empire into empire. Do that once, and then we turn around and do it all again. Empire is empire because empire conquers. Now, you don't have to be in the business of conquering for very long before you see it's a really messy business. In order to conquer people, you have to kill a whole lot of them. In order to conquer people, you end up raping people and selling people and enslaving people. And human beings have this decency thing going on inside, and conquering makes it very difficult to tell ourselves a story that we are decent people, because conquest gets very indecent very quickly. So, you know what we need? A story. We need a story that tells us that all this ugly stuff we're doing, it's really okay. And if we pervert our religious sin story, just the ticket, exactly what we need. Augustine wrote down original sin just a few decades after we'd gotten into bed with empire. He had a chance to see the newly empowered church, the no longer being persecuted and fed to the lion's church, but instead in the very seats of power, and that was intoxicating. It was all that power, all that respect after a long season of having been persecuted. He got to see our religion being carried to the far reaches of the earth, enforced with the Roman broadsword and phalanx, and it was a heady time and heady stuff. And if in exchange for all that wonderfulness, Rome needs a story, well, we can probably accommodate. We can help with that. And so here's the story that Augustine told. Since we're not Jews anymore, we can let go of all that animated by God's Spirit stuff. We can let go of all that carriers of the inner divine stuff. Here's our new story. All those people that get crushed under Roman power as we take province after province and nation after nation and people after people, all the tribute that we exact from them, all the blood and all the cruelty and all the impoverishing, no worries, because they are totally sinful. They are bad people and they're born bad. They're doing bad things because it is intrinsic in their nature, nothing they can do about it, and no exceptions. They are people with no redeeming virtue, original sin. Unless we convert them. If we get them on our side, then they'll be okay. Then they'll be like us, good people, but until then, no worth. Until then, depraved beings. Until then, no redeeming value. Now that sounds crazy when we say it out loud, but next week we're going to see how much that ancient story is still inside of us, all these centuries later, still dictating the terms of our current divisions. But for today, here's the thing. Get ready. Augustine was wrong. Now, that little pearl got me kicked out of a denomination. That little pearl cost us our building. We got it taken away from us because we said and still say Augustine was wrong. We are carriers of inner light, every one of us, every one of us. And that includes libtard Democrats and heartless Republicans and vaxxers and anti-vaxxers. We are carriers of inner light, every one of us. But the shape of the argument has been around for so long, it is hard to be rid of Augustine. It is hard to be rid of Rome. Because even when we reject the religion, the shape of that sin story, it's in deeply, deeply inside of us. Bad people doing bad things. And once that's the story, there's not really anything that we can do to act as oneness people in a two-ness world. Because in that story, those people are different from us. Different in a bad people kind of way. We can't reason with them. You can't change their minds. They aren't compassionate like we are. They aren't smart like we are. They're born bad, I guess. Maybe it's their DNA. Whatever it is, they can't be fixed. They're the ones making the world two, not us. We're trying to make the world one. If they weren't defective, they would come over here and get in the sheep line with us. If they weren't defective, they'd stop being bad people and they would start being like us, compassionate like us, smart like us. Well, you can see that story's still out there. And even when it stops being a religious story, it's still around. And there will be no oneness world as long as that is our framing story. So, it's time for the story I told you was coming. So here are the questions again to be thinking about. You might have read about the remains of Indigenous children being exhumed in Canada recently, buried around residential schools into which they were forced from the 1890s through until 1971. It's one of the darkest parts of our continent's history. Reminded me of a story that I read, and it's why I remembered that Christ for the Celts would be a great companion book for this lesson. The author was doing a talk in Ottawa, and he was giving a talk about the other parts of our tradition's story, the non-Roman parts of our religious story. And he was talking about the inner light in each of us. And he was talking about the divine that indwells each of us. And he was drawing from the writings of Celtic Christian teachers who had emphasized that. And he was drawing from the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of Paul. And at the end of the talk, here's what he wrote. He said, I invited those present to watch for that inner light in themselves, in one another, in the world, and especially in the wisdom of other traditions. And at the end of the talk, he said, a Mohawk elder who had been invited to comment on the common ground between Celtic Christianity and native spirituality, he stood up with tears in his eyes and he said, "Now I've been listening today, and I've been wondering all day long, where would I be today? Where would my people be today? Where would the Western world be today if the missionaries from Europe centuries ago had come expecting to find the light of God in us?" But they didn't. They came expecting to find ugly, ugly sinfulness because Rome, because Augustine, because a sin story run amok, because a sin story that is still driving harm, big social harm for indigenous people and racial inequity and Democrats and Republicans and vaxxers and anti, and harming our families and our neighborhoods, our own social fabric. And so, indwelling divine, may we leave behind the story of imperial Christianity. May we leave behind all the toxic instincts that go with it, and may we look for the divine light within all, even those we think of as bad people doing bad things. Amen. Well, if you would, prepare your offerings, and we all give online now, so that means get your phone out or set up a standard giving. And remember, as we say each week, that we are investing in the well-being of spiritual community. When we give our time and our energy and our dollars that it takes to be healthy, the return on investment is quite profound because it is transformative in our lives. And so if you would, go there and do that. And while you're doing that, in a moment, we are going to dismiss the live stream, and we're going to do What Are You Thinking here in the room. Now, again, if you're on the live stream and you would like to host a Zoom version of What Are You Thinking, it's different now, and I'll show you exactly how it's done. It is very doable. So far, I have one taker, and I am looking for 4. As soon as I've got 4 takers, then I think we can begin to rotate through. So if you would like to be one of those takers, use the Contact Us button, and I'll get back to you. Also, today's questions are in the live stream notes, so you can talk them over at home where you are. So if you would, let us put our hand on our hearts and remember as we go that we are, every one of us, carriers of the indwelling divine. We are, every one of us, carriers of inner light, love and joy and peace and kindness and goodness. The fruit of the Spirit is in us, breathed there from the beginning. And if you would extend your other hand to our SETI, let's look for opportunities to share what's in us with the people that we live and work and go to school with, looking for opportunities to repair and heal our worlds. Amen. Well, God bless you all too, but you are dismissed. So we'll talk to you and the rest of us. Let's stay